Okay, so I'm here to talk about Dart. If you have any questions, the link to the presentation is on the page. I see a couple of people have already figured that out and are viewing it. I find presentations to be very boring if you view the slides in advance, but that's fine with me. Feel free to send me an email. I work at Google. Dart is a project from Google, but I don't actually work on Dart. I just kind of picked it up in my spare time and thought it might be interesting to introduce it to you guys. And I'm also wondering, is there any like wireless microphone in this room? Yes, where? Yes. I like to walk around and not just like stand droning into the microphone for the entire talk. But until we have that figured out, I will try and attempt to go to the next slide. Hey, it worked. Okay, so after the talk, it's a 20-minute talk about a programming language. I don't think you can really say that much about a programming language in 20 minutes, so I'm going to have links throughout the presentation where you can go to learn more. There's actually the Dartlang webpage is, let me go ahead and click this allow button.
Wireless microphone.
Oh, thank you. Okay, this is better. Okay, so we have the Dartlang website. That is filled with information. It has a ton of documentation. It has videos. It has demos. It's really an amazing piece of documentary work, and you can learn a lot about Dart by visiting that site. And we have this book, which is a second link, which is a book that recently came out. It's up to date as of M3. The current version of Dart is M4. The only difference between M3 and M4 is that in M4, the libraries are now stable, so there aren't going to be any backwards incompatible changes, or at least that's my understanding. I started using Dart around the M1 time, and it seemed like every week somebody had changed the names of some core method, and then I had to rewrite my code. Or actually, since I was doing this at Google, the Dart team rewrote my code and sent me a change list to approve, so that was nice. But now it's stable, so there shouldn't be any stability problems, and you can write this code and trust that it's going to stay relatively the same. So, what is Dart? Dart is a dynamic language that you might use where you would use JavaScript. It compiles to JavaScript. I don't know if you guys were at the talk about JavaScript, but JavaScript is the assembly language of the web, and Dart will compile to that. What is cool, though, is that there's also a command line version, so you can run your Dart tests and sample code on the command line. There's Dartium, which is a version of Chromium that has a Dart VM built in, so you don't have to compile your code. You can just launch Dartium and immediately start hacking on it. There's DRT, which is Dump Render Tree. It's a WebKit debugging tool that Dart supports, and it's a headless browser that will dump the render tree when it's done rendering, like as text. And you can write your tests against that, and you don't have to start up a web browser and then write some pixel comparison software to see if there are any UI regressions. You can just look at the dump render tree output. I've not actually done that, but it seems cool. And finally, there's Dart2JS, which will take your Dart file and all its libraries and compile it to a JavaScript file. All right, so why would you use Dart? The big reason that Dart appealed to me is because I like to organize my code. I want to sit down and write a class. And Dart gives me this opportunity, whereas with JavaScript I always felt like I could do things really quickly. If I need to have an object, I just say foo:42, and now I can call this foo method that returns the value of foo. It's pretty cool, but I just feel like I can't keep all that in my head, and when I come look at it in a year or 6 months, I'm not going to know what's going on. Whereas with Dart, I can document explicitly in a class file what my data structures look like. That was the big sell for me. Other people might say it looks a lot like Java, and when you look at the code, I think you'll see that it's very Java-like. All right, I found it easier to write tests for than JavaScript. I've used Node.js and I've used client-side JavaScript, and I could never get my UI code to run in Node.js. So I couldn't write my application and then write a smoke test in Node.js to use my application code to hit my application server and simulate a user. With Dart, this is much easier. It has a cleaner, more feature-full core than JavaScript. I mean, it's a brand new language. We've learned a lot since JavaScript came out, and we didn't have to maintain backwards compatibility, so that's always good. The libraries are really beautiful. They're very Java-like. If you've ever used the Guava library for Java, it's kind of like that. I know Java is kind of a bad word around here, but they do have a few good ideas and occasionally make good libraries. They have a package manager like CPAN called Pub. You can just write your module, type pub publish, and upload it, and now everybody can use your module. It's pretty cool. There's a full-featured IDE, so there's like code highlighting, and it will like do syntactic analysis and find errors, and hopefully there's refactoring features. I haven't actually used that. I prefer Emacs, for which there is a mode. It does optimized code generation, which means that the code that you write is not necessarily what runs. And in fact, code written in Dart and compiled to JavaScript often runs faster than JavaScript. Like the same benchmark compiled with a Dart compiler runs faster when compiled to JavaScript as pure JavaScript. So the compiler is really smart. And it's a new language, so you choose where it's going, right? It's not in any browsers. It's still subject to change. So you can get on the mailing list and decide how you want this to work. I found a bug in the documentation in Dart a few weeks ago. I filed a bug at like CR Bugs or Dart Bugs or wherever the appropriate place is, and they had it fixed and pushed in an hour. So it's really nice. So why would you not use Dart? Well, it's a new language, and you choose its future. That means that your choice might be different from your choice, and you have to live with that. If other people make bad decisions that you disagree with, it can change. Whereas with JavaScript, what it is what it is. Yep.
So fast and my head is exploding. So I have a couple questions.
Sure.
So you compile a JavaScript, will it run in Node.js at JavaScript?
I would imagine it does, because it works with all the JavaScript engines.
But it's also, it has its own backend runtime, which effectively I could imagine could run JS. Could I write a CoffeeScript language that compiles a Dart backend?
Sure. I think the Dart team has said that their goal is not to be a VM for anything. They don't want to have a VM, it's just a development tool. JavaScript and V8 are the VM. So compiling to JavaScript is fine. Dart is just for humans to read and write, not for machines to execute.
So is it like a CoffeeScript?
It's very much like a CoffeeScript, yes.
Okay.
All right. And until recently, Dart changed every release, so you might not want that, right? Do you want to work on new features, or do you want to update your code base every time the Dart team makes a new decision? You have to decide whether or not you want to do that. It's not as bad now as it was, but you are a new user of this, and there are going to be bugs, and you're going to find them. All right, and so now you're probably wondering, why are we talking about Dart at a Perl conference? Well, we've talked about a lot of languages this week, Perl 6, Stevens Mo, et cetera, and there are good ideas in Dart that make programming really nice that we should consider stealing. And a lot of us write web apps, and so we get to write the fun part in Perl, and then like we have to write the client-side part, and JavaScript, if you like JavaScript, is good. If you don't like JavaScript, you just kind of want to get it over with. With this, you have a new, more powerful tool that you might enjoy more, and you'll make better user interfaces because your tools are better. And look at the documentation afterwards. It's beautiful, it's up to date, it's amazing. Look at the documentation. It's definitely great ideas to take from that. Okay, so let's just jump in and look at some code. So, you want to make a class, a point class, and it has an X and a Y. So we declare that there's an X and a Y, and we create this constructor. Now there's a lot of syntax sugar for constructors. We don't say like this dot X equals X, this dot Y equals Y. We just say this value passed in becomes X, and this value passed in becomes Y. And we also have optional types here. So we say that these are numbers, actually they're doubles. And we say it's final, which means they can't be changed. So this is an immutable object, and the compiler will enforce that. As you can see, we have some other syntax. So if we want to explicitly name these variables and then assign them later, this is like this dot X equals X, this dot Y equals Y. And we do it in this colon-separated initializer so that the compiler knows that we actually initialize all the final fields. If you don't initialize all the final fields in the constructor, it's an error. If you try to change the final fields after the constructor, it's an error. So you have this special syntax. And we can do the traditional Java-style constructor if this wasn't final, and just pass in X and Y and then explicitly assign them. Okay, what we can also have in Dart is something called named constructors. So if you want to provide a different type of constructor, you can do that. So we have a point.origin constructor This will create a point at the origin, so x and y are set to 0, and this is in addition to the normal named constructor. Oops. All right, and you can have as many named constructors as you want. So if you want to like take a JSON object and convert that to your point, you can just write a constructor to do that. All right, and to use these constructors, you just say new point, as you might expect. If you want to call one of the named constructors, you say new point dot whatever the named constructor is, and then that will just run. And so no matter how you create a new object, even if you're using some utility method, you always call new. So it's always clear to the reader of this code that you're creating a new instance of a class. I like that a lot. Okay, so let's take a look at an abstract class. An abstract class is one that you can't instantiate because it doesn't have all the stuff in there yet. Okay, what we're saying here is we're going to have a class called person and has a greet method that will say hello to them or something like that. So let's implement this class with the person impl, and it has a first name and a last name. We have a constructor for that, and we have a greet method for that, and it says hello, first name, last name. And you'll see that for variable interpolation, it works exactly like Perl. You just do $ and the variable name, and you don't have to say like this dot whatever or self dot whatever, because it's in that context already. All right, now what we can do that's really cool is you want to say something like new person, except new person is an abstract class, so you can't create an instance. But what we can do is we can make a factory constructor. And so we make a factory constructor for person that takes a first name and a last name, and that will delegate to person impl. So the users of your code don't need to know that this is an interface and you have a concrete implementation somewhere. They can just create a new person and they'll get the implementation that you chose in the factory constructor. And so if we run this code here, it'll say, hello, Jonathan Rockway. Another piece of syntax to point out, you can declare functions with this arrow operator, and that means this is just going to be a one-liner function. So we say main is defined as being this one line of code. And main is the entry point to your Dart program. There's no code just sitting out in the middle of nowhere. It's in a top-level definition or a class or in main. Okay, so how do we run this? Well, we can just say Dart and the name of the file, and it will run it. How do we compile it to JavaScript? We can just run Dart to JS, and it will output a JavaScript file that we just load, script source equals whatever. And then that will load the JavaScript file. All of your code gets compiled into this. There's an algorithm called tree shaking, which causes any code that you're not using to not be included in this file. Okay, so another thing we can talk about is that what happens if you run this? Remember how point took 2 doubles? So what happens if we supply strings instead? Any guesses? Any guesses? Okay, so somebody guessed exception, somebody guessed boom. Wrong. It just, it works, okay? The semantics of types in Dart are they cannot affect the runtime behavior of the application. They can only affect compile time behavior. So now you have this invalid point object and you're thinking to yourself, then what's the point of the types? Well, you can run Dart in checked mode, in which case it will do static analysis and check that you're not doing something illegal. So it says string is not a supertype or subtype of double, so you can't use it. And then the program will die. Finally, there's also a Dart analyzer, which will, without running your code, find these errors. So now we only saw X before because that was the first one, but this time we get X and Y. And so this will alert us to any problems in our code without actually having to run it, which is nice. And there's also IDE support, so this is the Dart IDE, and it will just underline things when you can't do that. All right, so now I'm concerned that I'm running low on time. I have until 11:55 or 12. Anybody know? Okay, all right. All right, so the type annotations. Basically, you don't need to use the type annotations except where somebody else is going to call your code. So if you just have a helper function and you want to assign it to a variable, we can just say final latitude, and that means we're creating a variable of any type that can't be changed later, and we calculate this. Now this calc latitude has a signature that decides on the type, and that's how we decide what type this value is, okay? And this prevents us, this just saves typing. So we don't detect any type errors. Like I could say final foo latitude, and if it actually returns a double, then it would blow up. But that's probably not going to happen because we can just wait for it to blow up when we get here, which is good enough. For the interface, though, we do want to define the return value and the type of the arguments so that we don't, so that we can use the static analyzer and detect errors before we even run the code. All right, so how do we test all this? Well, there's a unit test.dart, and it works like this. Oh, and I apologize for the line wrapping. It looks kind of bad. But we just say we want to test x. We have a function, anonymous function that takes 0 arguments, and we expect that point.x equals 1.0, and we expect that point.y equals 2.0. And then we can run this test with Dart and the name of the test file, and it will print out something saying that it passed. All right, another kind of cool feature in Dart is getters and setters. You don't have to encapsulate your values behind methods like getFoo and setFoo. You can actually access them directly like directly object.foo, object.bar, object.foo equals 42 or something like that. And we can define these methods to intercept that. So here's a rectangle, and it has a left top width and height. But you can also set right, and then it will update left for you. There's operator overloading, so you can just say operator plus like a regular method, and then you can add 2 points together. I'm not sure that makes any mathematical sense, but you can type in the code to do that if you feel like it. Usually you do this for equals equals, so you can have like value equality rather than are these two the same objects. Okay, one thing that I really like is the lexical scoping. So in JavaScript, if you create a closure in a for loop, all the closures end up with the value closed over as the last iteration of the loop after you're through the loop. In Dart, each time through the for loop, you get a new lexical context, and so we close over 0 first, then we close over 1, then we close over 2. And so when we actually evaluate this closure, it prints 1 because that's what we closed over, I equal to 1. All right, we have exceptions that are very Java-like, except we say try blah, blah, blah on the name of the exception. And we can either catch it with catch E or not type that and just ignore the value. Works like that. Finally, the finally block runs to clean anything up. There's this nice syntax sugar for sometimes you want to call a bunch of methods on an object, but you don't want to have every method return this because that's kind of annoying. You can just use the dot dot operator, and so this will create a new example object. Then it will set foo equal to 42 on that. Then it will set bar equal to 1, 2, 3 on that. And then it will call the something method on that and return that. So that's nice. All right, so we have 2 ways of reusing code in Dart. We have libraries and packages. Libraries give you a little bit of privacy. So if I define something in a library, only things that are also in that library can access methods or fields that start with an underscore like this. So if in this library foo, I include example.dart and try to call this foo method, it doesn't work. It doesn't exist when that's being compiled. It also lets you divide code into parts. So you can say library example, import a bunch of stuff, define the parts, and then in each of those files you have those imports, and they all become one library. So you can take a library and split it up into multiple files without copying and pasting a lot of code, which is nice. The packages work like Perl modules. You make a build file, and then you have a lib and test directory where the code lives. The build file looks something like this. The minimal one just says the name of my app. And you can declare your dependencies, install them by typing pub install. And then, so here's an example. So in point.dart, we say library point, class point. And then from other places in our application, we can refer to this, which could live anywhere. It doesn't have to be in lib, by the package name. We defined this my app thing in the pubspec.yml. And now Dart knows where to find this point.dart. Looks inside that package, even though you're already inside that package. That way you don't have to have nasty like relative paths like dot dot slash lib slash point.dart. Okay, so I think we've run out of time, so I'm going to open it up with questions. If anybody has any questions, ask me now, or come see me anytime. Yes? Yes, there's a web UI. Sorry, the question was, is there a web framework for Dart? Yes. I don't think anybody's using it for server-side web applications. I'm not 100% sure. But client-side, there's a ton of libraries. I wanted to go over those, but obviously 20 minutes isn't enough. If you look at some of the future slides, we begin talking about that. And you can take a look at the demos where the demos use web UI. There's this cool to-do one that I've linked from the demo slide. Yes? Yes, so all the concurrency is done with futures rather than threads. I believe that V8 can run this on multiple cores, but I'm not 100% sure about the implementation. I would ask on the Dart mailing list, and they'll know much better than I do. Good question, though. Anything else? Yes?
Going back to CoffeeScript, CoffeeScript's wonderful because it makes this beautiful syntax. Why did Dart pick the ugliest syntax possible?
Okay, so yes, it does look a lot like Java, and if there wasn't already a language called JavaScript, I would call JavaScript because it looks like Java, except that it's a scripting language. Unfortunately, that name has been taken for a language that looks nothing like Java. The reality is, a lot of programmers at Google write Java, and they like the look of it. They wanted something that would be familiar to Java programmers, since they're trying to pull people away from Gwt, which is Java that's compiled to JavaScript. And so this is what they decided on. Coffee Dart, as far as I know, is not taken as a name. Feel free to implement that. All right, guys, I've gone way over the time. Please enjoy lunch and talk to me if you have any questions. Send me an email. Thank you.